It is perfectly possible to know a person very well without ever having seen her face. The English climate affects the introduction. In Nettlestone-on-Sea, where the houses crouch like old cats along a windy terrace and the gulls take their meals standing, the figure of Miss Eleanor Tace occupied the position of a perpetual eclipse. Her drawing-room windows, which looked across to the grey freckle of the Channel, had not, as the postmistress informed the curate, been opened within living memory. "She has her reasons," said Miss Pottle of the post office, with the air of a woman who could have supplied them but preferred to make a reasonable profit from withholding. "And there's a sort of fungus grows upon them," she added, "as green as those fancy soaps." Into the ecclesiastical hush of this information came Lord Peter Wimsey, visibly bored with his motor, which had developed an ignoble hiccup on the hill above the vicarage. He was wearing a hat which had annoyed 3 counties and a tie that would have annoyed a 4th. While Mr. Bunter, in his usual manner, persuaded the carburettor to abandon its baser instincts, Lord Peter had sought the consolations of civilization at the vicarage, discovering there a well-conducted tea, a rain-patched copy of Horace, and the vicar's firm belief that the muffled tenor bell of St. Petrox had struck 13 the previous Sunday. 13? Said Lord Peter. My dear vicar, Horace himself would be moved to observe, non umque prematur in annum. Keep it 9. There is a respectable liturgical tradition for 9. You mean the fiat lux, said the vicar vaguely. I mean, said Lord Peter, that if bells are to misbehave, they should do it in the classical manner. There is a decency in limits. 13 is the vulgarity of zeal. He was diverted from this harmless pedantry by the arrival of Miss Pottle, damp from the sea, bringing a telegram addressed to the vicar or any person of responsibility. It was in the precise hand of Miss Tace's daily woman, Mrs. Relf, who did not trust the telephone. Her own words had, she explained, a way of going astray through the wire and coming out at the other end like a gentleman's. Please, vicar, come, the message said, with an urgency beyond punctuation. Miss Tace not answering door curtain wide. Wide? Said the vicar, rising so quickly that he upset an ecclesiastical biscuit tin. But she, Miss Pottle, will tell you, she never opens her curtains, said Miss Pottle, with the same relish with which she would have supplied arsenic to a man who had asked for tea. Never. Then we must not keep posterity waiting, said Lord Peter, and in 3 minutes he was in the street with his hat irresponsible upon his head, and Bunter following with the expression of a man who disapproves of the elements. Miss Tace's house, Mallard's, stood halfway along the terrace, facing the slate-coloured sea and presenting to it, like a forbidding hostess, 2 long windows of black velvet. The curtains had earned their reputation. They were of a dark plush that remembered the 19th century, and they hung lankly, as though whatever scandal they had once witnessed had exhausted their springs. To see them wide, and they were now drawn fully back upon their rings, was to suffer a small impropriety. The room inside stared out at Nettlestone with the virgin glare of a bedchamber door unfastened. The vicar knocked and called. There was no answer. Mrs. Relf's message had preceded them. She was hovering on the pavement, a woman of the angular school of piety, with a bonnet so rigid one felt it might be used in self-defense. It's not like her, she said, in the voice of doom which such women reserve for ordinary hours. I put the breakfast in by 9 sharp yestereen, always yestereen, never this morning. She will have it cold. I come again 9 this morning with the milk. The curtains. Here Mrs. Relf's voice took on a positive tremor. Was as you see 'em, gaping at God. Courage, Mrs. Relf, said Lord Peter. Bunter, have we a tool that will bore a moral hole without injuring property? Indeed, my lord, said Bunter, producing a thin strip of convincing steel. He applied it to the lock with so much unobtrusive respect that the door, which had meant to be offended, capitulated. They entered a room in which time had decided to bivouac. There were chairs of a door and excellent breed, 2 cabinets with legs like respectable calves, and Above the mantelpiece, a watercolor of a cow looking at a ship with anxiety. The place smelt of camphor, damp plush, and an acrid tang like a spent match. On the carpet, which had a pattern concealing nothing and forgiving less, lay a tight oval of pale dust where a small table had once been and was not now. Miss Tace sat in a high chair near the window as though she had been placed there to see the sea and had forgotten to do it. Her hands were politely folded upon a grey shawl. Her head drooped to one side with the exaggerated modesty of a portrait. She was an austere woman of about 65, with the jaw of a disappointed Roman and thin hair drawn back under a small cap, white as an apology. Her eyes were shut. There was no blood. Death had done his work like a butler. On the little table at her elbow, brought perhaps from that oval on the carpet, stood a tea tray, pot, cup, milk, sugar. The sugar had been disturbed, the milk unopened. A spoon lay on the saucer in an attitude of indolence. "Vicar," said Lord Peter softly, "I am sorry to make your acquaintance under such domestic circumstances." The vicar, who had been breathing in a Latin, exhaled and crossed himself with the wrong hand. "We must call Dr. Hexam," he said, "and Inspector Cattermole, and, Miss Pottle, if you please, go to the exchange and ask if any calls were put through to Miss Tace's number last night. Say the vicar desires it." Miss Pottle, who had the robust morality of the operator who listens only to what she cannot avoid, departed with professional alacrity. "Bunter," said Lord Peter, "you will observe that Miss Tace has been dead for some little while. The tea is tepid, Bunter, the very word, yet not curdled. The room is cold. The fire, there is no fire." Bunter, who would, if pressed, have expressed opinions on the climate of Hades, stooped to the grate. "No fire last night, my lord." But the grate was swept, and poorly. There's soot upon the inner sill and a smear upon the wallpaper where a hand has steadied a tray. The windows, which had been drawn back to their extreme with an air of having been forcibly introduced to daylight, showed on the inside of the glass a meagre pattern of dead moths and the delicate lathwork of lacewing wings. The sill itself had, as Miss Pottle had testified, a greenish bloom in the corners like a disreputable relish. Yet the brass casement handle was bright, with a spot near the pivot that had been recently rubbed. The latch was fastened. "Now then," said Inspector Cattermole briskly from the doorway, anticipating the vicar's messenger as only a policeman can anticipate fate. He was a short man with a moustache of the sort that clings to regulations. "What have we got?" "Good morning, your reverence." "Good morning, my lord." "Lord Peter, is it?" "I've heard of you. No offence meant to Nettlestone, of course?" "None taken," said Lord Peter. "We have Miss Tace, deceased. We have curtains that have, like Caesar, crossed the Rubicon. We have tea that declined to be drunk and a window that reinvented the word shut." Cattermole grunted. He approached Miss Tace with the caution of a man who has met death before and refuses to be impressed. He touched the wrist, lifted an eyelid, glanced at the mouth. "No marks," he said. "Dr. Hexam will give us the Latin. Sits as if she sat down to look out. Things she never did, as I am given to understand. Mrs. Relf, when did you last see Miss Tace alive?" "Yestereen at 6, said Mrs. Relf promptly. I takes away the tray from her supper, just a little salmon, if you please, in the Methodist magazine, and she says to me, as clear as you're there, 'Close the curtains, Mrs. Relf, and do not open them,' which, no more I would." "Quite right," said Lord Peter. "Obedience to last wishes is the beginning of civilization." Miss Pottle returned with her conscience bright. "Dr. Hexam's boy has gone for him on his bicycle," she announced. "And as for the exchange, there was a trunk call from Canterbury at 8:17 last night, put through to Miss Tace's number and lasted 2 minutes 52 seconds by the clock, which is our best clock, being the new one from Lewis." The voice at the other end was a gentleman's. Miss Tace said, "No," "I never open the curtains." She said it quite distinct, as if she had been saying it all her life and enjoyed it. Lord Peter had been wandering gently about the room, purchasing trifles with his eyes. He observed the mantel clock, which had stopped at 9:12. He noted the little bronze of a nymph, which, if asked, would not have explained whom it was meant to represent. He picked up, with a knuckle, a paper twist of blue tissue like the kind one finds wrapping cough lozenges. It lay in the grate, half charred. "Bunter," he said, "attend to the curtain rings." Bunter's expression indicated that he had anticipated the order and respected it. He examined the ringed pole, the cords, the tasseled tie-backs, the old pulleys with their burr of dust. "One ring has been forced, my lord," he said. "Here, towards the left. The screw-eye has a recent scratch, and the dust upon the pole is displaced as if a hand had been here to pull back the curtain without the cord." Inspector Cattermole raised a brow. "Meaning somebody came in and opened them?" "Meaning," said Lord Peter, "that somebody, having a hand, used it. Whether he came in or went out is one of those theological questions upon which the fathers are divided." The vicar, who had been staring at the sea as though it might be responsible, turned back. "Miss Tace," he said, in the tone of one who cannot help rebuking the dead for their irregularities, "has not been to church in 20 years. She sits," he added with a small burst of clerical indignation, "with her curtains shut on the Lord's Day." "You misquote the sabbatical law, vicar," said Lord Peter amiably. "The rest was for the curtains, not the curtains for the rest." Dr. Hexam arrived with something of the manner of a curate who has been suddenly promoted to bishop. He pronounced life extinct and time of death to be between 8 and 10 the previous evening. There was, in his opinion, no sign of violence or of any poison that leaves a signature. "Her heart," he suggested, "has been in a capricious condition for some years. It is a common thing for elderly ladies to expire suddenly." "Particularly," said Lord Peter, "if one arranges it." "Eh," said Dr. Hexam. "Figures of speech," said Lord Peter, who had the impish cruelty to leave the poor man with them. He wandered again to the window, looking out upon the sea. The tide was low. A strip of brown weed lay like a belt across the bay. Beyond it, the pale water trembled, and at the horizon a ferry, just a shadow, seemed to be considering France and thinking better of it. Outside, the bell of Saint Petrox struck the hour. 12 clear strokes that made a separate world of every man's morning. The sound sank into the room through the open windows like a judged thing. Miss Tace sat as she had sat, the sea behind her, the bright noon in front, and the black curtains drawn back at last, like the wings of some overpious angel who had been caught asleep on duty. Lord Peter, who loved a problem as some men love a mistress and others a morning in June, smiled very slightly and tucked his cane under his arm. "Fiat justitia," he said. "Fiat justitia ruat caelum," said the vicar, relieved to have the ending. "My dear vicar," said Lord Peter, "do not rush the heavens. Let us, for the present, be content if the curtains fall in the right place." He went out into the briny air with his hat at an angle sacrilegious enough to affront Nettlestone and please himself. The morning had settled into that methodical rhythm which Inspector Cattermole brought to all matters requiring official attention. Having dispatched Dr. Hexam with instructions to provide a proper medical opinion and stationed Constable Frith at the gate, with orders to admit no one without authority, he turned his attention to the systematic collection of statements. Lord Peter, meanwhile, had discovered a chair of uncompromising virtue near the window, and settled himself there with the air of a man prepared to be educated by the domestic arrangements of the deceased. "Now then, Mrs. "Ralph," said Cattermole, his pencil poised above a notebook that had seen service in matters ranging from poached rabbits to matrimonial disputes, "let us have the particulars of yesterday evening." Mrs. Ralph arranged herself with the dignity of one who possesses information and means to dispense it properly. 6 o'clock sharp, Inspector," I took away her supper tray. Salmon, as I mentioned, and the Methodist magazine. She'd had her tea earlier. Always a cup of Darjeeling at 4, with one digestive biscuit. Never more, never less. Very particular about her habits was Miss Tace, and her instructions regarding the curtains. Close the curtains, Mrs. Relf, and do not open them. Said it clear as anything, same as she'd said every evening for 20 years. I pulled them tight, made sure they overlapped proper. Wouldn't want the neighbors seeing in, though there's precious little to see in this room, poor soul. Lord Peter, who had been examining the mantelpiece with the concentration of a man reading scripture, spoke without turning. Mrs. Relf, you mentioned that Miss Tace was very particular. Might I inquire about her other regularities? The tea service, for instance. Was it always arranged precisely so? Oh yes, my lord. Everything just so. The tray on her little occasional table, the one with the carved legs that's been moved over there by her chair, 2 lumps of sugar placed careful-like with the tongs. Never stirred about, and the spoon always laid straight on the saucer, never at an angle. Whimsy glanced at the tea service, where the sugar showed signs of disturbance and the spoon lay with a careless abandon foreign to Miss Tace's established character. And visitors, Mrs. Relf. Did Miss Tace receive callers? Mrs. Relf's expression suggested that the word visitors belonged to a foreign language. Miss Tace didn't hold with casual calling, my lord. Mrs. Relf, she'd say, if Providence had intended us to entertain strangers, he would have provided larger parlors. But there was one gentleman who called regular, every Tuesday at 3 o'clock. She called him Mr. Nephew, though whether that was his name or his relation I couldn't say. Inspector Cattermole looked up from his notes. Describe this gentleman. Thin as a prayer book, Inspector, with a beard like a disappointed missionary. Always wore gloves, even in summer, and carried a leather satchel. Stayed exactly 1 hour as a rule. I could set my clock by him. But yesterday... Mrs. Relf paused with the dramatic instinct of her class. Yesterday he stayed near 2 hours, and when he left, Miss Tace was in what I called her letter-writing mood. Letter-writing mood? Whimsy had abandoned the mantelpiece and was now examining the escritoire by the window, a delicate piece that seemed to apologize for its own existence. She wrote terrible lots of letters, my lord, always at night by the lamp. I'd find them in the morning, all sealed and addressed, lying on the hall table for the post. Foreign places, some of them, Canterbury, London, even France. Very particular about the timing she was. These are to go with the morning collection, Mrs. Relf, and no delay. Whimsy's attention had focused on the green leather surface of the escritoire, where a small dark stain marked the blotter. Bunter, attend to this ink stain. Recent, I should judge. Bunter approached with the reverence due to evidence that has not yet declared its intentions. Fresh within the last day, my lord. The blotter shows impressions of recent writing, though reversed and illegible. The paper has been disturbed, not aligned as a careful person would leave it. And this morning, Mrs. Relf, was there a letter for the post? No, my lord. Which was strange, considering she'd been writing so regularly. But the grate. Mrs. Relf gestured toward the fireplace, where Bunter had discovered the charred remains of paper. There's been burning. Recent burning. Inspector Cattermole frowned. Destroying evidence? Or correspondence, said Lord Peter mildly. The two are not always synonymous, though they often keep similar hours. He moved to the window, examining the curtain mechanism with the attention of a man who expected mechanical objects to confess their secrets. The curtain cord, I observe, has been recently repaired. A fresh reef knot, Bunter noted. And the ring, forced, with a recent scratch on the screw eye. Meaning someone opened them after Mrs. Relf left? Cattermole asked. Meaning someone with hands used them, Whimsy replied. Whether that someone was departing or arriving remains one of those theological questions upon which the evidence maintains a diplomatic silence. From outside came the sound of Saint Petroc's bell striking the hour, 11 clear notes that seemed to settle into the room like invited guests. Whimsy tilted his head, listening. The bell, Mrs. Ralph, you mentioned Miss Tace's complaints about its recent behavior. Oh, that dreadful 13 on Sunday, my lord. Fair upset her, it did. Said it was ungodly and probably illegal. But it's been striking odd all week. Sometimes at the wrong hours, sometimes too many times. Miss Tace said it was trying to tell her something, and she didn't care to hear it. The acoustics of this room interest me, Whimsy observed, moving toward the door leading to the hall. Bunter, if you would be so good as to station yourself in the hallway while I experiment with the door. For the next few minutes, Lord Peter conducted what appeared to be an elaborate game involving the opening and closing of doors, the drawing and releasing of curtains, and careful attention to the way sound traveled through the house. The results, when tabulated, proved instructive. With curtains drawn and door closed, the room became a fortress of silence. With curtains open, the sea's conversation intruded. With door ajar, sounds from the hall crept in like cautious servants. Most illuminating, said Whimsy, returning to his chair. A house of variable hearing, depending upon the disposition of its fabric. Miss Tace, I suspect, could regulate her world's volume with considerable precision. Inspector Cattermole consulted his watch. I've sent word to Canterbury about that telephone call. Should hear back presently. And I'll want to speak with this nephew if he can be located. Indeed, said Lord Peter, his gaze resting on the stopped mantel clock. 9:12, the precise moment when time decided to abandon Miss Tace to eternity. One wonders what urgent appointment required such punctuality. He rose, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. Inspector, I believe our next consultation should be with the gentleman who tends Saint. Petroc's rebellious timepiece. Bell ringers, in my experience, possess an intimate knowledge of their neighborhood's sleeping habits. As they prepared to leave, Whimsy paused at the threshold, looking back at the austere room where Miss Tace sat in her final, unwilling audience with daylight. The opened curtains framed her like a theatrical revelation, transforming her private parlor into a stage where some drama had reached its quiet, inexorable conclusion. Come, Inspector, he said softly. The domestic unravels, but slowly, like a well-made knot. We must be patient with its revelations. They had scarcely stepped into the salt-touched air of Nettlestone's morning when Constable Frith approached with the measured urgency of a man who has discovered that duty and curiosity make uncomfortable bedfellows. Inspector, sir, there's a gentleman at the gate asking after Miss Tace. Says he's her nephew. Arrived on the 10:15 from Canterbury, he did, and seems considerable upset about the curtains. The gentleman himself forestalled further description by advancing with the tentative precision of a man who expected either condolences or arrest, and was prepared to accept either with appropriate dignity. He was precisely, as Mrs. Ralph had described, narrow as a theological argument, possessed of a reddish beard that suggested intimate acquaintance with disappointment, and wearing gloves of conscientious gray despite the September warmth. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder with the permanent air of containing either salvation or evidence. I am Stephen Lethbridge, he said, not aggressively but with the careful enunciation of a man whose words had learned to behave themselves. Miss Tace's nephew, her late sister's son. I came as soon as I received word from Mrs. Ralph. His gaze moved past them to the opened curtains, and his face underwent that subtle alteration which occurs when a fundamental law of nature appears to have been repealed. Good heavens, the curtains are, but she never— Quite so, Mr. Lethbridge, said Inspector Cattermole, with the professional sympathy of a man who had learned to comfort the bereaved while simultaneously suspecting them of murder. There has been an occurrence. You had best prepare yourself. They conducted him into the parlor where Miss Tace maintained her final, unwilling audience with daylight. He approached the chair with a hesitant respect due to a shrine that had suddenly declared itself secular, then stopped, removing his hat with a gesture that managed to be both reverent and bewildered. "Aunt Eleanora," he said quietly. The words carried the weight of 20 years' worth of Tuesday visits and carefully modulated conversations. "I spoke with her only yesterday. We discussed—" He paused, glancing at the opened curtains as though they might provide testimony. She seemed in her usual health, if somewhat agitated about certain family matters. Family matters? Cattermole had produced his notebook with the alacrity of a man who recognized a motive when it presented itself with such admirable directness. "Inheritance questions, Inspector. My aunt had recently expressed intentions to alter certain provisions in her will. There were disagreements about the wisdom of such changes." Lethbridge's hands tightened on his satchel. "I had hoped to persuade her to reconsider some rather harsh decisions regarding distant relatives who had, in my view, been treated with unnecessary severity." Lord Peter, who had been examining the mantelpiece with the concentration of a man reading hieroglyphics, turned his attention to their visitor. "You telephoned her last evening, I believe? The exchange has confirmed a call from Canterbury at 17 minutes past 8. "I did, my lord," from the kiosk at Cathedral Gate. "I discovered certain documents which I felt might influence her position on the inheritance matter. She listened, but—" He glanced again at the curtains. "She said what she always said when she disapproved of something: 'I never opened the curtains.' It was her figure of speech for closing a subject. And yet," observed Whimsy mildly, "here they are, open to their fullest extent, as though they had suddenly developed evangelical tendencies." Cattermole consulted his notes. "Your movements yesterday, Mr. Lethbridge, if you please. The complete itinerary. I arrived on the 2:40 from Canterbury. I walked directly here. My aunt expected me at 3 o'clock precisely. We discussed the inheritance matters until nearly 5. The conversation was difficult. She had made up her mind to disinherit certain parties whom I felt deserved consideration. I left somewhat earlier than usual, caught the 6:15 back to Canterbury, and supped at my lodgings." "Your lodgings being?" "Mrs. Hartwell's in the Close. I am a lay reader at the Cathedral Inspector. I assist with various ecclesiastical duties and do copying work for a religious publisher. A modest existence, but an honest one." Whimsy had wandered to the window, apparently absorbed in the sea's morning conversation with the shore. "The gloves, Mr. Lethbridge. A medical necessity." Lethbridge flushed slightly. "A chronic condition of the skin, my lord. The salt air paradoxically improves it, though I must protect my hands from direct contact with most surfaces." My aunt was quite understanding about it. She detested disorder of any kind, and appreciated that I took care not to disturb her arrangements. "Most considerate," murmured Whimsy. "And after your telephone call last evening?" "I remained in my lodgings. I spoke briefly with Mr. Bryson, the verger, about the recent irregularities in our bell striking. There was practice scheduled, and I occasionally assist when needed. The bells have been troublesome lately, striking at odd hours, sometimes 13 when they should strike 12. It has been a source of some concern in the Close." Inspector Cattermole looked up from his notes with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were arranging themselves in proper order. "So you had motive, the inheritance dispute. You had opportunity, regular access to the house, and you made contact with the deceased on the evening of her death." "Inspector," said Lethbridge with the weary patience of a man who had learned to expect misunderstanding, "my aunt's death benefits me not at all. She had already placed her property beyond my influence through a trust arrangement. I hoped only for an act of charity toward others, distant cousins who had fallen on difficult times. If you discover my fingerprints upon those curtains, you will have found evidence of a miracle, for I have never touched them in 20 years of visits." Lord Peter had returned from his contemplation of the sea, his expression carrying that particular quality of amusement which suggested he had discovered something both illuminating and ironic. "Mr. Lethbridge, you present us with a most satisfactory suspect. Motive, opportunity, and the additional virtue of having telephoned your victim on the evening of her death. Inspector Cattermole is quite right to find you interesting. However, he continued, settling his hat at an angle that suggested philosophical speculation, there remain certain theological questions about the precise mechanics of curtain opening from Canterbury by force of moral persuasion. Inspector, might I suggest we verify Mr. Lethbridge's train times while he takes tea at the vicarage? The railway, unlike human nature, maintains scrupulous records." Cattermole nodded with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed suspects who remained conveniently available for questioning. As they prepared to escort Lethbridge to more comfortable confinement, Wimsey paused at the threshold, his gaze resting once more on the opened curtains that had transformed Miss Tace's private parlour into an unwilling stage. "Come, Inspector," he said softly. "Our nephew provides us with all the elements necessary for a proper arrest. Nevertheless, I find myself curious about bells that strike 13 and curtains that open themselves. The domestic arrangements of the deceased, I suspect, may prove more complex than even her nephew's theological difficulties. With Mr. Lethbridge safely deposited at the vicarage, where the consolations of seed cake and scripture would occupy his Protestant conscience, Inspector Cattermole departed to verify railway timetables with the methodical thoroughness that marked his approach to all documentary evidence. This left Lord Peter free to indulge what Bunter recognized as his irrelevant curiosity expression, a particular arrangement of features suggesting that obvious solutions held all the charm of yesterday's newspaper. "Bunter," he observed, returning to the parlour where Miss Tace maintained her final audience with daylight. "Murder possesses the peculiar virtue of drawing one's attention to domestic trivialities. This carpet, for instance, a thoroughly respectable Brussels, yet showing patterns of wear that suggest careful avoidance rather than natural traffic." Bunter, who had been conducting his own survey of the room's geography, produced a small fibre for inspection. "Indeed, my lord. The pile shows distinct impressions where furniture has rested for extended periods, then been recently displaced. The occasional table, specifically, moved precisely 18 inches toward the window within the last day. Yet Mrs. Relf, who prides herself on knowing every domestic particular, made no mention of furniture rearrangement. Wimsey knelt beside the pale oval where the table had formerly resided, stroking the carpet with the delicacy of a man reading Braille. The track to the window shows lighter nap, suggesting recent passage of something heavy. Most illuminating. His attention shifted to the curtain mechanism, examining the tiebacks with renewed interest. The tasseled cords hung with dejected air, clearly relieved of their usual duties. The right-hand tieback remained stiff with accumulated grime, but its partner showed signs of recent, forceful use. Threads pulled loose and bearing what appeared to be a small, dark stain. "Sealing wax, my lord," Bunter confirmed, applying his pocket lens with scientific precision. "Red sealing wax, though we discovered no sealed correspondence." "Sealing wax," mused Wimsey. "Yet Mrs. Relf mentioned burned letters. Someone conducted an elaborate correspondence ritual here, writing, sealing, then destroying the evidence." He moved to the mantelpiece, where the stopped clock maintained its testimony to 9:12. "This timepiece particularly intrigues me, Bunter. Miss Tace's legendary punctuality, yet here we have mechanical abandonment at a most specific moment." Bunter's examination revealed deliberate interference, the pendulum displaced and weights adjusted with knowledge and intent. "Someone familiar with clockwork has been here, my lord." The stoppage at 9:12 was precisely engineered. 9:12, a time that coincides with neither Miss Tace's established habits nor any documented events of yesterday evening. Yet someone considered it significant enough to preserve for posterity. Whimsy examined the clock face, noting a faint smudge on the glass, bearing traces of the same red wax found on the tie back. The grate yielded further mysteries. Among the cold ashes lay charred fragments of what Inspector Catamole had identified as legal correspondence, words like inheritance and revocation still legible, along with traces of a Canterbury address. The sweeping had been recent and hasty, leaving telltale soot upon the inner sill. Someone, observed Whimsy with growing amusement, has staged a most elaborate theatrical performance in this room. Every element arranged with dramatic precision. The opened curtains after 20 years of closure, the displaced furniture, the deliberately stopped clock, the burned correspondence. From outside came St. Petrock's bell striking the hour, 12 clear notes that seemed to mock the stopped clock's insistence on 9:12. Whimsy tilted his head with the concentration of a man who expected even church bells to provide testimony. The acoustics of this room fascinate me, Bunter. Our earlier experiments revealed variable hearing depending upon the disposition of curtains and doors. With curtains drawn and doors shut, the room becomes a fortress of silence. With curtains open, the sea intrudes. With door ajar, sounds from the hall creep in like cautious servants. Including the church bell, my lord. With the room sealed, St. Petrock's striking would be barely audible, with curtains open as they now are, quite distinct. Precisely. Miss Tace could regulate her world's volume with considerable precision. If she counted her hours by St. Petrock's rebellious timepiece, she counted them when she chose. Whimsy moved to the window, examining a faint smear on the inner glass. A fingerprint overlaid with traces of red sealing wax, suggesting someone had pressed against the window from inside while handling sealed documents. The tea service also merits attention, he continued, approaching the tray where Miss Tace's final refreshment waited in perpetual suspension. The spoon lay at an angle inconsistent with her military sense of alignment. The sugar bowl, when lifted, revealed a ring of unaccustomed cleanliness on the tray, as if replaced not quite in its native position. The milk remained obstinately unopened, floating a thin skin that judged the morning chill. Someone shared Miss Tace's final tea, Whimsy concluded, though Mrs. Relf assures us she entertained no casual callers. An uninvited guest, perhaps, or one whose invitation was of a most particular nature. As they prepared to investigate St. Petrock's rebellious bell mechanism, Whimsy paused for a final survey of the parlor. The opened curtains, displaced furniture, stopped clock, and burned correspondence all participated in some elaborate deception whose purpose remained tantalizingly obscure. "Come, Bunter," he said with the satisfaction of a man who had begun to perceive the outline of a particularly elegant puzzle. The domestic arrangements grow more theatrical with each revelation. I suspect Miss Tace's final evening was considerably more eventful than a simple telephone call from Canterbury would suggest. Let us now consult with those who tend to Time's mechanical servants. They often possess intimate knowledge of their neighborhood's temporal irregularities. The bell tower of St. Petrock's rose against the grey Channel sky with the stubborn persistence of medieval faith confronting modern doubt. Its keeper, Mr. Bryson, possessed the weathered dignity of a man who had spent 30 years persuading bronze to behave itself at liturgically appropriate moments. He received them in the nave with the cautious hospitality reserved for gentlemen who appeared to take ecclesiastical machinery seriously. "The bell's been fractious lately, my lord," he admitted, leading them up narrow stone stairs that spiraled toward the belfry with architectural determination. "Started Monday last, striking at odd hours, sometimes too many times, sometimes falling silent when it should speak. Yesterday evening particularly vexing. They emerged into the belfry, where the great bell hung in its oak cradle like a bronze oracle awaiting consultation. The striking mechanism revealed itself as a marvel of medieval persistence, gears, weights, and escapements arranged with the stubborn logic of centuries. Bryson indicated recent adjustments to the hammer linkage, where someone had altered the timing sequence with knowledge and precision. Young Mr. Lethbridge worked on this section Tuesday evening, Bryson explained. Bell practice, 8 to 9:30. He's got a scholarly hand with clockwork. Said our striking was running ahead of Canterbury Cathedral's by several minutes. Wanted to synchronize it proper, being from the close and particular about such things. Whimsy examined the mechanism with the attention of a man who expected mechanical objects to confess their secrets. The adjustment was recent and expert, designed to delay the striking by precisely 12 minutes. Mr. Bryson, if this alteration functioned correctly, at what time would your bell strike 9 o'clock? Bryson calculated with methodical precision. 9:12, my lord. Exactly 9:12. The precise moment, observed Whimsy with growing satisfaction, at which Miss Tace's mantel clock ceased its temporal duties. He exchanged glances with Bunter, who had been examining the bell rope with professional interest. And Mr. Lethbridge's presence during this mechanical surgery. You can vouch for it. Present from 8:20 until 9:25, my lord. Had him on the rope when the bell struck 9. Gave us 13 instead of 9. Then went silent. Mr. Lethbridge seemed particularly upset by the 13. Said it was theologically inappropriate and suggested we complete the adjustment immediately. Most illuminating. Whimsy descended to find Inspector Cattermole awaiting with the satisfied expression of a man whose documentary research had yielded profitable results. The railway confirms interesting details, my lord. The 6:15 to Canterbury was delayed yesterday by signal trouble. Didn't actually depart until 6:37. Station master remembers Lethbridge seemed agitated about the delay, kept consulting his watch. When the train finally departed, he was last aboard, running from the direction of town, not the waiting room. 22 additional minutes in Nettlestone beyond his stated intention, Whimsy calculated. Time enough for a brisk constitutional to his aunt's residence, if one were so inclined. They walked toward the sea wall where the morning tide was beginning its retreat, exposing the strip of sand that would, by evening, provide convenient passage below the terrace. Whimsy consulted the tide table posted at the lifeboat station with mathematical precision. High tide yesterday at 9:05, he observed, by which time our mysterious chronology was already established. Curtains opened, clock stopped at 9:12. Tea service arranged to suggest a later hour. He paused, examining the posted times. Yet observe, Inspector, at 8 o'clock yesterday, the tide was sufficiently low to permit beach access to Miss Tace's terrace. Someone wishing to avoid the main road could have approached unseen. At the railway station, Mr. Best confirmed the previous day's irregularities with bureaucratic precision. 6:15 delayed to 6:37, my lord. Mr. Lethbridge took the original service, as scheduled. But here's the curious bit. He didn't return on the 8:42 last evening, though that's the only night service. Next train this morning at 10:15. Yet someone telephoned Miss Tace at 8:17 from Canterbury. Whimsy mused. The exchange confirmed the call originated from Cathedral, Gate Kiosk. If Mr. Lethbridge was demonstrably in the bell tower from 8:20 onward, either he possesses remarkable powers of bilocation, or someone else made that call. Returning to Mallard's, Whimsy conducted what appeared to be an elaborate acoustic experiment, positioning Bunter at various points while testing how sound traveled through the house under different conditions. With curtains drawn and doors closed, the room became a fortress of silence. With curtains opened, the sea's conversation intruded distinctly. Most significantly, the church bell's striking carried clearly across the green when windows were unsealed. The acoustics, he pronounced, are quite precise. Miss Tace could regulate her world's auditory intrusion with considerable exactitude. If she complained about Sunday's 13 strikes, it suggests her room was not in its usual sealed condition. But Mrs. Relf insists the curtains were always drawn at 6. Cattermole protested. Habit, Inspector, provides an excellent alibi, until someone who understands those habits exploits them. Whimsy examined the tea service again, noting the disturbed sugar and carelessly placed spoon. Consider our chronology. Miss Tace died between 8 and 10. The telephone call at 8:17 lasted 2 minutes 52 seconds. Miss Pottle heard her say, "I never open the curtains," clear and distinct, as if she'd said it all her life. Meaning? Meaning, Inspector, that someone intimately familiar with Miss Tace's phraseology answered that telephone. Someone who could echo her habitual responses with practiced propriety. The exchange hears voices, not bodies. Bunter, who had been examining the great's charred remains, offered additional testimony. The correspondence was burned after sealing, my lord. Red wax fragments among the ashes, suggesting letters were prepared, sealed, then destroyed. The ritual of someone conducting elaborate preparations. Precisely. Someone created a theatrical performance in this room. Curtains sealed with moral wax, clock stopped at the mechanically significant moment of 9:12, correspondence prepared and destroyed. Every element arranged to suggest Miss Tace's death occurred at a time when her nephew was demonstrably under ecclesiastical bells, establishing perfect alibi. "Then who?" demanded Cattermole. "Someone," said Whimsy with the satisfaction of a man whose puzzle was revealing its underlying geometry, "who possessed intimate knowledge of Miss Tace's habits, her nephew's movements, bell tower mechanisms, and tide tables. Someone who understood that mechanical precision could provide perfect temporal deception, if one knew how to manipulate both clocks and witnesses." He paused at the threshold, looking back at the austere room where Miss Tace sat in unwilling daylight. "Come, Inspector, our chronology is tested and found wanting. The minutes, miles, and tide tell us one story, but human nature, I suspect, will tell us quite another. We must now discover who possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to conduct such elaborate temporal manipulations." The revelation came, as such revelations often do in houses where secrets have been carefully tended for decades, through the patient archaeology of domestic concealment. Bunter, who possessed the professional instinct for discovering what respectable people preferred to keep undiscovered, had been conducting a methodical examination of Miss Tace's modest library. It was behind the collected sermons of John Wesley, a volume whose moral weight had apparently recommended it for purposes beyond spiritual edification, that his practiced fingers detected the telltale looseness of a false backing. "My lord," he announced with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been vindicated by furniture, "the deceased appears to have maintained a private archive." The hidden compartment yielded its treasures with reluctant dignity. A leather portfolio secured with faded ribbon, several thin ledgers bound in morocco, and a collection of correspondence that bore the unmistakable patina of systematic concealment. Lord Peter received these domestic relics with the reverence due to evidence that had begun to explain itself. The first document resolved the mystery of Miss Tace's comfortable independence. A marriage certificate, dated 1883 in Simla, revealed her as Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, widow of Colonel Reginald Blackwood of the Indian Army. The colonel's will, preserved with scrupulous care, established a trust providing £400 annually to his beloved wife, a sum representing considerable prosperity for a woman of modest requirements, contingent upon her maintaining the respectability appropriate to a military widow. "Most illuminating," Whimsy observed, examining the careful legal phraseology. The colonel possessed Victorian sensibilities about widowhood. Mrs. Blackwood receives her comfortable independence at the price of perpetual mourning. Any marriage, or indeed any romantic entanglement that became publicly known, would forfeit the inheritance entirely. Inspector Cattermole, summoned to witness this domestic archaeology, consulted his notebook with renewed interest. Then the spinster of Mallards was actually a widow of considerable means. Precisely. But observe the elegant deception required to maintain both respectability and income. Mrs. Blackwood receives her widow's pension through Canterbury solicitors, while Miss Tace maintains her reputation for genteel poverty in Nettlestone. The perpetually drawn curtains ensure that neither identity compromises the other. The correspondence revealed the full complexity of Miss Tace's double life. Letters addressed to Mrs. E. Blackwood arrived monthly from Messrs. Whitfield and Sons, solicitors, delivering the trust income with suitable discretion. But a second collection, bearing various signatures, Ellen Vale, Eleanor Lacey, even once Eleonora de Sacy, told a more intricate story of carefully managed obligations. Among these papers lay a child's birth certificate, printed on thin foreign paper. Marguerite, fille naturelle, née à Dieppe, 1899. No father was named, but the accompanying correspondence revealed 20 years of regular payments to Madame Vasseur, Rue des Boucheries, Dieppe, money orders sent under the name of Lacey or Vale, never Tace. The French connection, Whimsy murmured, arranging the documents chronologically. Miss Tace, or Mrs. Blackwood, maintained a daughter abroad, supporting her through careful postal arrangements that preserved the fiction of her English respectability. But the revelations did not end with France. A series of receipts from Mrs. Hartwell of Canterbury Close documented another, more local arrangement, payments for the care and education of a young gentleman of serious temperament suited for the church. The amounts, when calculated, corresponded precisely with Stephen Lethbridge's upbringing and education. Good heavens, breathed Inspector Cattermole. Then Lethbridge is either her son or her charity, Whimsy replied. The documents maintain a diplomatic silence on the precise relationship. But observe the pattern. Miss Tace supported both a daughter in France and a young man in Canterbury, while maintaining the public fiction of spinster respectability that preserved her widow's income. Miss Pottle, when consulted, confirmed the postal arrangements with the satisfaction of a woman whose professional curiosity had been vindicated by events. 20 years of money orders, my lord, regular as the tide, always under different names, Lacey, Vale, sometimes Blackwood for the Canterbury solicitors. When I questioned it, Miss Tace said, "I have reasons, Miss Pottle, and they are good ones." Good reasons are like petticoats. They are not for public display. Mrs. Hartwell, confronted in her Canterbury lodgings, admitted to the arrangement with the wariness of one whose discretion had been professionally purchased. "I took in infants for respectable parties unable to manage them at home," she said, her alpaca-clad conscience maintaining its commercial dignity. Miss Tace, though she gave other names, was a good payer. The boy never knew his true circumstances. The final piece of the puzzle emerged from Miss Tace's recent correspondence with her Canterbury solicitors. Draft documents, prepared but not yet executed, revealed her intention to legitimize both arrangements. Formal recognition of Marguerite as her niece and heir, and acknowledgement of Stephen's true relationship to the family. The inheritance that Lethbridge had discussed so earnestly was not merely money. It was identity itself. "Consider the implications," Whimsy said, settling into Miss Tace's austere parlor, where the opened curtains now seemed less like theatrical revelation than desperate confession. Someone discovered the full extent of Mrs. Blackwood's masquerade. Someone learned that the impeccable spinster was actually a widow of means, supporting two dependents through elaborate deception. "Blackmail," suggested Cattermole. "Or prevention of exposure," Whimsy replied. The quarterly payments to France and Canterbury represented not merely charity, but the maintenance of a complex lie. If someone threatened to reveal Mrs. Blackwood's true circumstances to the trust administrators, or to expose the illegitimate arrangements to Nettlestone society, the entire structure would collapse. The sealing wax found on the curtain tie-back now acquired new significance. Miss Tace had been preparing correspondence, perhaps the very documents that would have legitimized her secret arrangements. The burned papers in the grate represented not casual destruction, but the elimination of evidence that someone could not afford to have discovered. The telephone call at 8:17, Wimsey continued, establishes Miss Tace as alive when Mr. Lethbridge was demonstrably in Canterbury. But consider, someone intimate with her affairs, someone who knew her habitual responses, could have answered that call convincingly. The phrase, "I never open the curtains," was her standard response to unwelcome suggestions. Then the murderer was present during the call. Present and sufficiently familiar with Miss Tace's voice and manner to maintain the deception. Someone who knew both Mrs. Blackwood's financial arrangements and Miss Tace's domestic habits. Someone who understood that exposure would mean not merely scandal, but the destruction of carefully maintained dependencies. As evening approached, casting long shadows across the parlor where Miss Tace sat in unwilling communion with daylight, Wimsey gathered the scattered documents of her double life. The marriage certificate, the birth records, the correspondence, all testified to a woman who had lived 2 lives with scrupulous precision, maintaining both respectability and secret charity through 20 years of careful deception. "Come, Inspector," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man whose puzzle had begun to reveal its underlying geometry. "Miss Tace's other name provides us with motive, method, and a most interesting question of inheritance. We must now discover who possessed sufficient knowledge of Mrs. Blackwood's affairs to conduct such elaborate temporal deception, and who stood to lose everything from her planned legitimization of long-hidden truths." The opened curtains, which had seemed merely theatrical, now appeared as the final gesture of a woman who had decided, at last, to let light into a life built upon necessary shadows. It remained to discover who had found that illumination unbearable. The morning light, filtering through Miss Tace's rebellious curtains, illuminated details that had waited patiently for proper interpretation. Lord Peter, returning to conduct what he termed a systematic archaeology of domestic deception, found that yesterday's evidence had acquired new significance in light of Mrs. Blackwood's revealed complexities. "Bunter," he observed, examining the window-sill where greenish accumulation had been disturbed. "Observe the curious mixture of substances in these corners, not merely the honest grime of decades, but recent additions of a more cosmopolitan nature." Bunter applied his lens with scientific precision, producing upon a clean card the finest drift of particles. "Beach sand, my lord, of the variety found below the terrace at low tide, and here, traces of whiting mixed with ammonia. Silver polish, I should judge, of the commercial preparation. Silver polish upon a sill that has enjoyed 20 years of curtained protection," Wimsey mused. "The sea in the parlor and the pantry upon the window, a domestic hymn set to a decidedly irregular tune." He examined the brass casement handle, noting again that bright spot where recent polishing had removed accumulated tarnish. Someone familiar with this window's mechanism conducted considerable maintenance work. Mrs. Relf, summoned to witness this forensic archaeology, bristled with professional indignation. "There may be sea in Nettlestone, my lord, but it does not walk into Mallard's uninvited, and my silver polish stays where it belongs, in the pantry, not upon window-sills." "Yet here it is," Wimsey replied mildly, "accompanied by sand that suggests intimate acquaintance with our local tide tables. Inspector, someone approached this house from the beach, conducted silver cleaning operations at this window, then departed by the same route." The tea service yielded additional testimony under renewed examination. The silver salver, which Mrs. Relf insisted belonged beneath the tea tray, bore fresh scratches on its underside, abrasions consistent with contact with rough surfaces. Wimsey aligned the salver with a corresponding mark on the window-sill, achieving perfect correspondence. The occasional table, he announced, was moved precisely 18 inches toward the window. The salver, displaced from its proper position, was used as a lever or prop during this furniture rearrangement. Someone required elevation to reach the curtain mechanism and left their signature in scratched silver. Bunter had discovered additional evidence among the curtain arrangements. The right-hand tie-back bore not merely the red sealing wax noted earlier, but clear signs of having secured something substantial. Several threads had been pulled loose, and the cord showed recent knotting with a fresh reef knot. The tie-back was employed for purposes beyond curtain management, Bunter reported. The disturbance suggests it was used to bind or secure documents, perhaps the correspondence that was subsequently burned. A methodical mind at work, Whimsy observed. Someone who understood that every detail required careful arrangement. The curtains opened with mechanical precision, the furniture displaced for practical access, the correspondence prepared and destroyed according to schedule. Mr. Drage at the chemist's, when consulted, confirmed the purchase of silver polish and red sealing wax by a veiled lady at 5:30 the previous evening. Foreign accent, my lord, though she spoke English with excessive correctness. Paid with English coin after I refused her French money. Proper patriotic principle, that. The fish boy, extracted from his maritime duties, provided crucial temporal evidence. Saw the veiled lady at the terrace top just before 6, my lord. Had a round parcel under her arm, wrapped in brown paper, big as a plate. And last night, coming back from the quay with my uncle, I saw light in Miss Tace's parlor at 9 when the bell went all peculiar. 13 strikes instead of 9. The curtains twitched like someone had hands on them. Light at 9, Whimsy repeated with satisfaction, when the bell, adjusted to strike at 9:12, delivered its theological impropriety. The timing suggests our mysterious visitor remained for the evening's performance. Miss Pottle, re-examined with diplomatic tact, admitted revision of her telephone testimony. The voice that said, "I never open the curtains," was lower than Miss Tace's usual tone, my lord. The Canterbury line flattens voices of an evening. If pressed to locate that accent on a map, I should place it considerably nearer France than Kent. Inspector Cattermole consulted his notes with growing comprehension. Then someone answered that telephone call, someone who knew Miss Tace's habitual responses well enough to maintain the deception. Someone intimately familiar with both her domestic arrangements and her characteristic phraseology, Whimsy confirmed. The curtain mechanism was manipulated with practiced knowledge. The tea service arranged according to established ritual, and the correspondence burned after proper sealing, all suggesting long acquaintance with Mrs. Blackwood's methods. The charred remains in the grate told their own story of elaborate preparation. Legal documents had been written, sealed with ceremonial red wax, then destroyed. Not casual destruction, but systematic elimination of evidence that someone could not afford to have discovered. Consider the pattern, Whimsy said, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose puzzle was revealing its underlying geometry. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of Miss Tace's habits, access to her house, familiarity with her financial arrangements, and motive to prevent her planned legitimizations of long-hidden relationships. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the parlor where every detail testified to careful staging. Come, Inspector. The sill, the salver, and the tie-back have provided us with the mechanics of deception. We must now discover who possessed both the knowledge and desperation to conduct such elaborate domestic theater. The curtains have been opened, literally and figuratively. It remains only to illuminate the performer who arranged this final, fatal scene. The evening mist rolled in from the channel with the punctuality that had made Nettlestone's tides legendary among those who counted their hours by maritime precision. Lord Peter, having arranged the parlor at Mallard's with the meticulous care of a stage manager preparing for opening night, settled himself in the shadows beyond the kitchen passage where observation would yield its proper dividends. Inspector Cattermole, stationed in the garden with Constable Frith, maintained the professional patience of men who had learned to trust whimsy's theatrical instincts. "The tide reaches its evening low at 9:15, Bunter," Whimsy observed, consulting his pocket watch with satisfaction. "Our mysterious visitor will require beach access to avoid the main road's inconvenient publicity. Someone familiar with Nettlestone's maritime rhythms has been conducting rehearsals. St. Petrock's bell, restored to its proper timing by Mr. Bryson's reluctant cooperation, would strike 9 o'clock with mechanical orthodoxy." The parlor lamp cast its square of light across the terrace through curtains that had been carefully arranged in their opened position. The tea service sat upon the occasional table, displaced precisely 18 inches toward the window, with the silver salver positioned on the inner sill, where recent scratches testified to its employment as lever and prop. The first movement came at 8:47, a shadow detaching itself from the mist-shrouded path that descended from the upper town toward the beach. The figure moved with purposeful familiarity, carrying what appeared to be a small valise and advancing with the measured gait of someone who had walked this route before. The mist provided convenient concealment, but Whimsy's trained observation detected the continental manner of movement. Weight distributed evenly, steps placed with precision rather than haste. "French deportment," he murmured to Bunter, who had positioned himself at the rear window with field glasses. 20 years of correspondence with Dieppe would provide excellent instruction in maintaining one's balance on uncertain terrain. At 9 o'clock precisely, St. Petrock's bell delivered its honest 9 strokes, each note settling into the evening air with ecclesiastical authority. During this acoustic distraction, the figure reached Mallard's rear terrace and approached the window with practiced confidence. From the valise emerged a length of rope and what appeared to be the missing element from Mrs. Relf's silver collection, a small serving piece that caught the lamp's reflection. The window yielded to gentle manipulation, opening with the silent cooperation of a mechanism recently maintained. The figure entered with fluid economy, moving immediately to the tea service where delicate hands arranged the spoon at its careless angle and disturbed the sugar with knowing precision. The mantel clock received similar attention, pendulum adjusted, weights reset, the whole mechanism restored to its testimony of 9:12. But it was the curtain manipulation that revealed the true sophistication of the performance. The tie-back was employed with professional knowledge, securing what appeared to be correspondence before the papers were transferred to the grate, where they joined the charred remains of previous literary efforts. Red sealing wax gleamed briefly in the firelight before dissolving into ash. The figure moved with the confidence of long familiarity, conducting what appeared to be a final accounting of domestic arrangements. Every gesture suggested intimate knowledge of Miss Tace's habits, the precise placement of furniture, the ritual preparation of tea, the ceremonial destruction of correspondence. This was not burglary, but something far more complex, the careful arrangement of evidence by someone who understood both its significance and its proper disposal. At 9:25, as the figure prepared to complete the evening's choreography by departing through the window, Lord Peter stepped into the lamplight with the quiet authority of a man whose patience had been rewarded. "I should not complete that particular exit if I were you," he observed conversationally. "Inspector Cattermole has developed strong opinions about people who employ windows for purposes other than illumination." The figure froze, silhouetted against the opened casement like a performer caught between scenes. A gloved hand tightened on the window frame, and for a moment the evening balanced on the edge of flight or surrender. "The beach access is admirably planned," Whimsy continued, advancing with unhurried precision, "but Constable Frith has been enjoying the sea air for the past hour. Maritime surveillance, one discovers, provides excellent opportunities for professional development. Inspector Cattermole's bulk appeared in the doorway with the inevitability of official procedure, while Bunter materialized from the kitchen passage with his customary discretion. The figure remained motionless, caught in the lamp's revealing circle like a specimen prepared for scientific examination. "Come now," said Whimsy gently, his voice carrying the particular kindness reserved for those whose elaborate deceptions had reached their natural conclusion. The performance has been admirable, but every theatrical evening must eventually yield to the prosaic demands of explanation. Inspector, I believe our visitor has considerable testimony to provide regarding the domestic arrangements of the late Mrs. Blackwood. The curtains, which had witnessed 20 years of careful concealment, now framed a scene of revelation as complete as it was inevitable. The opened window, the displaced furniture, the manipulated timepiece, all had played their parts in an elaborate deception whose final act was only now beginning. The figure remained motionless for a heartbeat, silhouetted against the opened casement like a performer caught between scenes. Then, with the resigned grace of one who recognizes that elaborate deceptions must eventually yield to simpler truths, she removed the concealing veil. The face thus revealed bore the unmistakable lineage of the woman who sat in permanent audience with daylight, the same austere jaw softened by continental refinement, the same intelligent eyes that had learned to observe without betraying what they had seen. Mademoiselle Marguerite Vasseur, said Lord Peter with the courtesy due to a worthy opponent, or should I say, Mademoiselle Blackwood. The family resemblance, once illuminated, proves quite unmistakable. She straightened with dignity that transcended circumstances, addressing him in English deliberately precise yet touched with the continental exactitude that Miss Pottle had detected during the telephone deception. I am Marguerite Vasseur, as I have been called these 20 years. My mother preferred the fiction that preserved her English respectability. Inspector Cattermole produced his notebook with official precision, though his expression suggested a man grappling with domestic complexities beyond his usual purview. "You are under arrest for—" "Inspector," Whimsy interrupted gently, "let us first establish the complete architecture of deception. Mademoiselle Vasseur has constructed something far more elaborate than simple murder." He settled into Miss Tace's chair with the satisfaction of a mathematician whose theorem had proven itself. The geometry begins with sugar, proceeds through silver, and concludes with sealing wax, each element precisely calculated. "You came twice yesterday," he continued, his voice carrying the particular kindness reserved for those whose elaborate plans had reached their inevitable conclusion. The first visit as the veiled lady whom the fish boy observed at 5:30, carrying a parcel big as a plate. You purchased silver polish and sealing wax from Mr. Drudge, paying initially in French coin, a small betrayal of origins. This visit was to prepare the stage and administer the fatal dose. Marguerite's composure remained intact, but her gloved hands tightened slightly. You understand nothing of 20 years' dependence upon postal orders signed with false names. On the contrary, I understand precisely. Your mother had written of her intention to legitimize the arrangements, to acknowledge you formally and provide Stephen with his proper inheritance. But legitimization threatened the very secrecy that had protected you both. If the trust administrators investigated too closely, they would discover not merely an acknowledged niece, but an illegitimate daughter born in Dieppe. The entire income would be forfeit. The method was elegant in its domesticity, Whimsy continued. Digitalis, prepared from the foxgloves that grow wild on the French coast. Dr. Hexam found no poison that leaves a signature because Digitalis obligingly avoids autographs. You knew your mother's heart was capricious. A concentrated dose in her evening tea would mimic natural failure. The sugar bowl tells the tale, Bunter observed quietly, producing 2 lumps that differed subtly from their companions. Poured into a mold and dried, showing a faint gloss and inexact angles. The concentrated digitalis was contained within false sugar lumps, dissolving when stirred into the Darjeeling. But the staging required even greater precision, Whimsy noted. You moved the occasional table 18 inches toward the window, using the silver salver as a lever, hence the fresh scratches on its underside that correspond exactly to marks on the inner sill. You opened curtains that had remained closed for 20 years, stopped the mantel clock at 9:12 to match the bell tower's adjusted timing, and prepared correspondence with red sealing wax before burning it in the grate. At 8:17, when Stephen telephoned from Canterbury, you answered in your mother's voice, using her characteristic phrase about never opening curtains. Miss Pottle's ear for accents placed the speaker nearer France than Kent, but telephone lines flatten evening voices, and you had practiced that particular response for years. Marguerite's mask finally cracked, revealing the desperate calculation beneath her continental poise. She was dying when I answered that call. The digitalis acts swiftly on a weakened heart. I merely completed the performance. The performance designed to implicate Stephen while providing him with perfect alibi, Whimsy observed. You knew his bell-ringing schedule, his delayed train, his precise movements. The evidence would point toward him, motive, opportunity, access, while his presence in Canterbury's bell tower during the crucial hours would create suspicious perfection. You returned tonight to retrieve documents that might expose your existence to investigators, but the geometry of your lie, while mathematically precise, failed to account for one variable: the simple fact that elaborate deceptions inevitably reveal themselves to those who understand human nature's arithmetic. Inspector Catamol stepped forward with official authority. Marguerite Vasseur, I arrest you for the murder of Eleanor Blackwood, also known as Miss Eleanor Tace. She accepted the handcuffs with continental dignity, her gaze resting once more on the woman who had been both mother and mystery. She never understood that some curtains should never be opened. The legitimization she planned would have destroyed us all, you, Stephen, myself. I preserved the arrangement that had sustained us for 20 years. Alas, said Whimsy softly, examining the draft documents from Miss Tace's escritoire. You destroyed the evidence without reading it. Your mother's proposed legitimization was carefully crafted to preserve the trust income. She would claim you as her dear sister's orphaned daughter, educated in France, a fiction the Victorian trustees would accept readily. Stephen would receive acknowledgement as her nephew, with provisions ensuring all parties' security. The revelation struck with the force of tragic irony. Marguerite had committed murder to prevent a legitimization that would have saved everyone, destroying the very documents that contained her salvation. The opened curtains, Whimsy concluded, rising with his hat at an angle that suggested philosophical melancholy, were meant to symbolize concealment's end. Instead, they became the stage for revelation's cruelest performance. You feared the light would destroy your shadows, never realizing it would have set you free. As they led her away into the nettlestone night, the curtains of mallards remained open, framing the empty chair where Miss Tace had sat in final, unwilling audience with the truth. The sea beyond continued its eternal conversation with the shore, indifferent to human geometry and the tragic mathematics of misunderstood love. The handcuffs settled upon Marguerite's wrists with the quiet authority of British justice, yet she received them with the continental dignity of one who had lived 20 years, knowing that discovery might arrive with any morning's post. Inspector Catamol's charge room, redolent of wet oilskins and institutional tea, provided an incongruously prosaic setting for the conclusion of so elaborate a deception. You need not caution me about statements, Inspector, she said, her voice maintaining that precise English which had so successfully deceived Miss Pottle's practiced ear. I have been preparing my confession for 20 years, every postal order signed with false names, every letter written in my mother's voice, all rehearsal for this moment. Bunter arranged the evidence upon the scarred desk with methodical precision. The small molds for fashioning false sugar lumps, bearing traces of concentrated digitalis, fragments of red sealing wax, the rope fibers from the curtain tie-back, grains of nettlestone sand from her hem. Each item testified to the elaborate choreography of murder disguised as natural death. The method was elegant in its domesticity, Lord Peter observed, examining the doctored sugar lumps that gleamed with telltale artificiality. Digitalis prepared from French foxgloves, molded into false lumps and dried. Dr. Hexam found no poison signature because Digitalis obligingly avoids autographs, particularly in a heart already weakened by age and anxiety. "I came twice yesterday," Marguerite confirmed, with the weary precision of one whose elaborate lies had finally exhausted themselves. "The first visit at 5:30, as the veiled lady purchasing silver polish and sealing wax. I prepared the stage, administered the dose in her evening tea, then waited, while the Digitalis performed its work. When the telephone rang at 8:17, I answered in her voice. I never opened the curtains, maintaining the deception while she died in her chair." Inspector Cattermole's pencil moved steadily across his notebook, recording the mechanics of matricide with official thoroughness. "And the staging afterward. Every detail calculated to implicate Stephen while providing him perfect alibi. I moved the occasional table, opened curtains that had remained closed for 20 years, stopped the mantel clock at 9:12 to match the bell tower's adjusted timing. I prepared correspondence with ceremonial sealing wax, then burned it in the grate, evidence of the legitimization I believed would destroy us all." The charge room door admitted Stephen Lethbridge, pale and rigid in constabulary custody. For a moment, the two faced each other with that unnameable recognition of enemies born from the same impossible necessity. "You were there," he said hoarsely. "In the room, while I was in Canterbury." "I was always there," she replied with bitter precision. "Only the curtains were between us." Lord Peter moved slightly, his voice carrying that particular gentleness reserved for those whose elaborate sins had been committed in service of impossible loyalties. "The tragedy, mademoiselle, lies not in your crime, but in your misunderstanding. The documents you burned without reading, they contained your salvation, not your destruction." He extended the draft papers from Miss Tace's escritoire, their legal phraseology carefully crafted to legitimize both relationships while preserving the trust income. "Your mother planned to claim you as her dear sister's orphaned daughter, educated in France, a fiction the Victorian trustees would accept readily. Stephen would receive acknowledgement as her nephew. All parties' security would be ensured." The revelation struck with the force of Channel gale through opened windows. Marguerite's hands trembled as she examined the documents, her continental composure finally cracking as the full, awful irony settled upon her. A single tear traced its salt path down her refined cheek. Not remorse, perhaps, but the crushing recognition of futility. "Non, non, ce n'est pas possible," she whispered, her English abandoning her for the desperate cadences of her native tongue. "I thought she meant to expose us, to cast us adrift to protect her English respectability. The last letter from the solicitors spoke of final arrangements. I believed it meant severance, not salvation." "She chose to open the curtains," Stephen said with bleak gentleness that did him credit. "Literally and figuratively. After 20 years of darkness, she decided to let in light." "Light that I believed would blind us all," Marguerite replied, her voice hollow with the recognition of irreversible error. "I merely ensured that some curtains remained closed. Forever." As inspector, Cattermole prepared to escort his prisoner to more official accommodations. Marguerite paused at the threshold, looking back toward Mallard's, where her mother maintained her final audience with unwonted daylight. "She never understood," she said quietly, "that some shadows exist not to conceal shame, but to protect love. The postal orders, the false names, the careful distances, all of it was love, expressed in the only currency available to women who had learned to count their affections in postal regulations and trust provisions. And yet," observed Whimsy with the weary irony he reserved for his own nation's peculiarities, "love expressed in shadows often becomes indistinguishable from the darkness it inhabits. The geometry of deception, once begun, develops its own inexorable logic. The door closed behind them with the finality of judgment, leaving only the sound of the sea's iron conversation with the shore and the ticking of the station clock. In the distance, St. Petrock's bell struck the hour with restored honesty, 9 clear notes that seemed to mock the elaborate temporal deceptions that had preceded this moment of simple, terrible truth. The morning after justice had declared its verdict dawned with that particular clarity which follows moral storms when the air itself seems cleansed of deception. Lord Peter found himself once more in the parlour at Mallard's, where the opened curtains continued their vigil over the Channel's grey conversation with eternity. Mrs. Relf bustled about with the fierce domesticity of one whose professional routine had been disrupted by French persons and their irregular methods of conducting family business. 20 years I kept those curtains proper closed, she declared, attacking the mantelpiece with unnecessary vigour. Foreign ideas, that's what comes of postal orders to France and Methodist magazines read by lamplight. Stephen Lethbridge sat by the window with the pale dignity of a man who had discovered that his entire existence rested upon foundations he had never suspected. The documents that would have legitimized his position lay before him like archaeological fragments of a life that might have been, their legal phraseology now rendered tragically moot by circumstances beyond anyone's intention. "I never knew," he said quietly, his gloved hands resting with clerical precision upon his knee. 20 years of Tuesday visits, and I believed myself merely the recipient of Christian charity. She called me Mr. Nephew because I was her nephew, not courtesy but concealed truth. "Indeed," Whimsy replied, settling into Miss Tace's chair with the satisfaction of a man whose puzzle had achieved its final, melancholy resolution. "Your aunt possessed the Victorian genius for managing impossible emotional arrangements through careful linguistic precision. Mr. Nephew maintained both affection and proper distance, a masterpiece of domestic diplomacy conducted under the auspices of Darjeeling and moral propriety." Inspector Cattermole arrived with the satisfied expression of a man whose case files had achieved bureaucratic completion, though his face bore traces of the bewilderment that complex human motives invariably produced in those charged with reducing them to legal categories. "Magistrates committed her for trial, my lord. Plea of guilty to manslaughter, with considerations of family circumstances. The Crown prosecutor believes French extenuating circumstances will complicate matters. English juries don't understand postal orders to Dieppe. Justice," Whimsy observed, "possesses its own peculiar geometry. Marguerite Vasseur committed matricide to prevent a legitimization that would have saved everyone concerned. The irony would have provided Sophocles with excellent material, though it offers cold comfort to those who must arrange the practical consequences. Dr. Hexam, summoned to provide final medical testimony, confirmed what the investigation had revealed. Advanced cardiac condition, my lord. The digitalis merely hastened what would have occurred within months. In medical terms, the daughter abbreviated rather than caused her mother's death. The false sugar lumps were ingeniously prepared. Concentrated foxglove essence, molded and dried with considerable botanical knowledge. The method, Whimsy reflected, was elegant in its domesticity. 20 years of correspondence with France provided excellent education in the preparation of herbal remedies. Marguerite understood both her mother's habits and her medical vulnerabilities. The tragedy lies not in the execution, but in the fundamental misunderstanding that motivated it. The vicar appeared with that mixture of ecclesiastical authority and human curiosity, which marked his approach to parish mysteries that had resolved themselves in directions the liturgy had not anticipated. Most irregular, my lord. 20 years of deception, illegitimate arrangements, French correspondence, all conducted under the auspices of Methodist publications and punctual tea services. My dear vicar, Whimsy replied with gentle irony, the domestic arrangements of the human heart recognize no denomination. Mrs. Blackwood managed her impossible loyalties with mathematical precision. maintaining respectability while supporting dependencies that would have scandalized the trust administrators. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of practical theology, charity expressed through elaborate postal deception. As the various officials departed with their documentation and testimonies, Lord Peter remained in the parlor where morning light continued its ancient conversation with objects that had learned to speak of human complexity. The tea service sat precisely as Mrs. Relf had arranged it. The mantelpiece bore its usual cargo of respectability, and the opened curtains framed their eternal view of the Channel's indifferent wisdom. "The curtains, Bunter," he observed, rising with his hat at an angle that suggested philosophical resolution, "provide the morale of our domestic tragedy. They were drawn for 20 years to protect arrangements that could not bear Victorian scrutiny. When Mrs. Blackwood decided to open them, she meant to demonstrate that love, properly managed through legal fiction, need not fear daylight. A lesson in domestic architecture, my lord. A lesson in human nature, Bunter. We construct elaborate deceptions to protect what we value, never realizing that the very complexity of our lives often destroys what we sought to preserve." Marguerite believed legitimization meant exposure and ruin. She could not comprehend that her mother had discovered a method for bringing their arrangements into respectability without sacrificing their security. Stephen approached with the subdued clarity of a man who had been public property for several days and found it an unnatural condition. "You have my gratitude, Lord Peter, for the bell mechanism, among other revelations. I think I shall leave Nettlestone. The sea has become too articulate about matters I prefer to forget." "Quite wise," Whimsy replied. "Seas are like family secrets, admirable at a distance, insufferable when they begin to speak with excessive candor about one's private arrangements." He paused at the threshold, looking back at the room where Miss Tace had conducted her final, unwilling audience with daylight. "Come, Bunter. We have witnessed the collision between Victorian propriety and human necessity. Mrs. Blackwood's curtains were opened too late for salvation, but perhaps not too late for understanding. Fiat lux, but gradually, lest sudden illumination blind those who have lived too long in necessary shadows." They departed into the salt-touched morning, leaving Mallard's to its new transparency. Behind them, the open curtains continued their vigil over arrangements that had finally achieved the light their architect had intended, though at a cost that rendered the illumination Pyrrhic. In the distance, St. Petroc's bells struck the hour with restored honesty, its bronze voice carrying across the water toward France, where the consequences of misunderstood love would continue their own complex arithmetic of regret and recognition.